In this video, I'm going to tell you why I don't use the background eraser tool, and I'm going to show you two methods that you can use instead. One for Photoshop CS6 and another one for Photoshop in the Creative Cloud. So first of all, why am I making this video? I've received so many messages of people asking me one of two questions. First of all, if I have a tutorial on the background eraser tool, and number two, if I don't have one, to please make a tutorial on it. And instead of making a tutorial on the tool, I decided to make a tutorial on why I don't think you should use that tool. And to properly do that, I have to go into the tool, show you how it works, show you the results, and then show you alternate methods that you can use instead. And hopefully I can make the argument to persuade you not to use that tool and to use newer tools instead. And when I say newer tools, that's because the background eraser tool was first added into Photoshop back in version 5.5 in 1999. That's over 21 years ago. And as far as I know, that tool hasn't been updated since then. So the algorithm, the technology inside of that tool is very old. And Photoshop has definitely had some improvements in other tools or new tools that allow you to make selections and remove backgrounds. And again, in my opinion, they give you better results. So let me jump right into Photoshop and show you why I don't use the background eraser tool. So we'll start by looking at the background eraser tool, select it from the toolbar. And this tool is easy to use. All you need to do is click on the background and Photoshop will delete pixels that are similar to the color that you clicked on. And that's the big keyword here. It deletes pixels. This is a destructive method, which for me is an issue. And of course, there's ways to work around that. But in my opinion, it creates more work and it takes more time. So I'll undo that and I'll duplicate the layer by pressing Ctrl-J on Windows, Command-J on the Mac so that we can work non-destructively with a copy of the original background. So let's go back into the sampling options. We have this first sampling option, which is contiguous. That means that Photoshop will continue sampling as you click and drag. See that? And this is why a lot of people find this tool magical. It seems like it's doing a fantastic job here around the edges over here. The next sampling option is once, meaning you click once to sample a color and you can click and drag and Photoshop will only erase the original color that you clicked on. In this case, it really doesn't make much of a difference because the background is essentially one solid color. Then you have the background swatch. In other words, Photoshop will sample from your background color swatch. Then you have the limits. I was using this contiguous, which allowed me to go in between hair strands to delete pixels. In this case, that was the best option, but you have others like find edges, which probably would be better for edges around her sweater. Then we have the tolerance slider, which determines how close to the original color that you sampled Photoshop will take into account to erase. So with a low tolerance value, when I click, Photoshop will only delete pixels that are very similar to the pixels that I clicked on. And if I have a high tolerance value, Photoshop will delete a wider range of pixels. So I can set the limits back to this contiguous and I can keep clicking and dragging to delete pixels like so. And I'm trying to give this tool a fair shot. So I'm just going to reduce my brush size and just make sure that I get the best result possible. And this is why a lot of people consider this tool to be magical, because it seems like it's giving us great results. But as you can see, in areas where the colors are very similar, the results are not as great. So I just have to be careful. And again, I'm trying to really give this tool a fair shot. So I'm going to be as careful as I can be and just delete the background like so. And I really have to make a small brush here because the pixels on the edge of her shoulder there are very similar to the pixels that I'm sampling from in terms of shade. I could probably bring down the tolerance a little bit and then maybe work on this area here, because I'm looking at some pixels that are really close in terms of value. And this is why a lot of people find this tool to be an amazing tool, because it seemingly gives you good results. But what I'm going to do now is create a new solid color fill layer and we'll set it to black like so and press OK. And as you will see, the results are not as good as they may seem. And you might be thinking, well, yeah, why don't you go in there and fine tune the layer? And I'll do that. I'll fine tune it. I'll increase the tolerance and I'll just make sure that I delete all these pixels so that I can show you guys the best possible result to give it a non-biased review like so. And I gotta be careful because I went into her shoulder there, as you can see, and I'm painting these edges and also these here as well. And I see that I have a lot more work to do on top. And you're actually already looking at one of the other problems. It takes a long time to get decent results. And notice that I accidentally went into her hair there, so I just need to be a little more careful when I make these adjustments. So it looks like this is probably going to be the best that I'm going to be able to get. And you might be thinking, well, I've seen videos or I've seen workshops where the results are much better. And I can almost guarantee you that if you're watching somebody use this tool, they'll probably use a bright background. So maybe something like a bright green. As you can see, with a bright green, a lot of those edge halos and those issues are gone. Same thing with yellow and other colors that are similar. So you can see that using these bright colors help you hide a lot of those imperfections. And even if you're watching a tutorial where the instructor uses a black background, the next step will be to create a layer mask and then fine tune the layer mask. So what that means is that they will take the background layer, press Ctrl J on Windows, Command J on the Mac, and then go to the layer thumbnail and hold Control on Windows, Command on the Mac, and click to make a selection out of those pixels. At this point, we can just delete the layer. We won't need it anymore. And then apply that selection to another copy and create a layer mask. And that gives us basically the same result, but with a layer mask. So if you're keeping tabs, you'll notice that we've duplicated the layer twice just to work non-destructively and have a layer mask. The next thing that you'll see people do at this point is one of a few things, which is either use the burn tool to continue fixing these imperfections, or go into the selected mask workspace and apply the refine edge tool and simply click and drag to refine the edges of her hair, like so. And then maybe add a little bit of contrast and maybe shift the edge inward a little bit to get better results. And that looks pretty decent. Her shoulder doesn't look as good. We have other problems with her hair, but you know, it wasn't difficult to get to this point. My argument is that you can do a much better job much quicker, even if you're in Photoshop CS6. Remember, the background eraser tool came out in Photoshop 5.5 in 1999, over 21 years ago as of this recording. So the technology in CS6 is a lot newer, and obviously the technology in Photoshop 2020 is miles ahead. So why don't we look at what you can do in Photoshop CS6. Let me select the background copy, press Ctrl J on Windows, Command J on the Mac, and drag this layer up, and I'll call it CS6. If you're in Photoshop CS6, what you can do that will give you better results is go into the quick selection tool and use the bracket keys on the keyboard to adjust your brush size and click and drag over your subject like so. And in my opinion, this is much faster than using the background eraser tool. We don't have to create two duplicate layers to work on a non-destructive workflow. We just have to be a little careful here on these smaller areas like so. And I can simply create a layer mask. And you might be thinking, well, this is not much better than what we had here. My argument is this was much faster to create without even adjusting it. So if I adjust it now, I'll get better results. But you might be saying, well, yeah, if you use the selected mask workspace, you're gonna get better results. Remember, we said this is for CS6. In Photoshop CS6, we didn't have the selected mask workspace. Instead, we had the refine edge dialog box. Let me bring that up. I'll go into select, hold shift, and click on selected mask, which will bring up the old refine edge dialog box. And by the way, if you're in CS6, you don't have to hold shift and go into the select menu. You'll see an option for this dialog box in the options bar or in the properties panel, or in the actual select menu, you'll see the refine mask option if you have a layer mask selected. But anyway, what you would do in this case in Photoshop CS6 is use this tool, the refine edge brush tool, and click and drag, just like I did earlier with the background eraser tool on the selected mask workspace. And I'll also add a little bit of contrast and shift the edge inward and press OK. So this is my result with CS6 and my result with the background eraser tool. Now, even if you think that the background eraser tool did a better job, I'd argue that CS6 was way faster and it actually did a better job. We have better edges here on her shoulders. You can compare the two here, and the hair is not much better. And we also have a lot of stray pixels. If I were to double click here on the background copy and click on stroke and make sure that I have a red stroke and I set my stroke to outside, you'll see all the stray pixels that are found in this image. So see that? See how it's deceivingly good? There's actually pixels that are there hidden that you probably won't be able to see with the naked eye. And this is yet another reason why I don't like using the background eraser tool. And to make a fair comparison, I'll also apply the stroke effect to the CS6 layer. And when I enable the stroke, you'll see that the only stray pixels are around her hair, which is to be expected. Now let's take a look at what you would do in Photoshop 2020 and newer. I'll duplicate the layer, I'll drag it up above the color fill layer, and I'll call it 2020. And there is no question that in Photoshop 2020 and newer, the background eraser tool is obsolete. In my opinion, it was obsolete in CS6, but I can definitely make that claim in 2020. And I can get much better results in about 20 seconds. You can time me if you like. The first step is to click on the remove background button, which will use artificial intelligence known as Adobe Sensei. This is state-of-the-art machine learning technology. It will select the background and create a layer mask. Then I can double click on the mask to go into the selected mask workspace, and I can use the refine edge tool to quickly refine the edges. And when I'm done, I'll just press OK. So as you can see, much better results, much faster. So this is the background eraser tool so that you can compare. And you can go back and look at the tutorial to see how long it took me to get to this point. And in Photoshop 2020, in about 20 seconds, we got this result. My argument is not that 2020 will give you perfect results. The results are not perfect. There's still some imperfections that we need to worry about. I'll even copy the red stroke layer style onto the 2020 layer so that you can see. By the way, to copy an effect, you can hold Alt on Windows, Option in the Mac, and click and drag that effect to another layer to make a copy. But you can see that when I enable the effects, the results are much better than even the results in Photoshop CS6. Much quicker. So again, the results are not perfect. They're much better and much faster. What you would need to do at this point is fine-tune this layer mask to make it look more realistic. And if you want to learn how to make better layer masks, you can check out my video from last week where I showed how to enhance layer masks for compositing. I'll place a link to that video down below in the description. So let me know in the comments down below if I persuaded you not to use the background eraser tool, or maybe you are using it and you want to keep using it. Please let me know in the comments how it benefits you in your workflow. Maybe there's something that I missed. And if you notice that I missed something, let me know in the comments as well. And of course, if this is your first time at the Photoshop training channel, then don't forget to click on that subscribe and notification button so that you don't miss any Photoshop tutorials. My name is Jesus Ramirez. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you again in the next video.